All right, as we sometimes say, thanking God and praising Him for the chance to start yet another book of the Word. Let's call Zechariah, or at least let's consider it by the theme, the remnant. Two, as in 200, because in time, Zechariah is going to seem to be a contemporary of Haggai, who was prophesying to the remnant in Judah who had stalled out on the work that they were supposed to be completing on the temple. Zechariah, however, because the remnant was split between those still in captivity and those who went back to start the rebuilding of Jerusalem, he seems to have more of a global perspective or a dual perspective on those who had gone back and those who were still in captivity, looking forward to the time when they could go back to Jerusalem. And with that, I don't really have a title for chapter 1, but I guess preacher hack or study hack. Zechariah is one of those books, once again, that I'm not very familiar with. And in addition to that, structurally, it's super unique because it doesn't have a lot of obvious connections or consistent themes throughout its chapters. And so even though it does have some consistent themes, they aren't obviously set out in each chapter. You have to look beneath the symbolism to see the consistency, or at least I did. With that, the first chapter breaks up into 3 sections. This time, once again, I'm going to follow just the ESV's organization because similar to the other prophets, he is going to have in verse 1 context. So let's just start out there. In the 8th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, saying, and then it's going to go on from there. But it should be interesting to note, I guess, that he is starting out in the very same year that Haggai prophesied to the remnant that had already gone out to Jerusalem. Anyway, he is going to continue on with what he said in that first section. I'm going to do rough summaries. Once again, trying to stay away from the temptation to do too much when I'm not very familiar with the passage. But the first section is essentially going to talk about the history of how they got here, meaning their fathers sinned, and likewise, they had repeated some of those same sins. What ends up happening is he's going to ask them to consider the sins of their fathers, consider how it turned out for their fathers, and turn. Interesting thing, similar to what we saw in the book of Haggai, they actually are going to listen to the Lord. And so by the time we get to verse 6, it's going to quite simply say, so they repented. And that is going to once again seem to give us a similar theme or a similar pattern to what we saw in Haggai. God has whittled down the remnant to those who would actually listen. With the second section going from verses 7 through 17, talking about the vision of a horseman riding on a red horse, standing in the middle of some myrtle trees with 3 horses around him, not necessarily mentioning 3 other horsemen, but Zechariah is going to find out that those horses are the patrol that goes out to the earth, coming back with a report that the earth remains at rest in verse 11, going on to say that the angel that is standing in the middle, kind of narrating or explaining things to Zechariah, is going to ask the Lord a question. Lord, how long are you going to stay angry at the remnant, or the remnant left from the people of Judah, understanding that the 70 years has elapsed? And God at that point is going to turn to let him know that the time's pretty much run, because his anger was there, but it was not there forever. And so he is then going to turn his attention to the nations. And that's where the 4 horsemen, the horses that went out to patrol the earth, are going to seem to be relevant to the rest of the chapter, because what God is going to say is, even though the earth is at ease, God is not happy. Even though his anger has decreased against his people, he is upset with those who went, once again, too far in executing judgment against his people. She's literally going to say in verse 15, where he's going to say, I am exceedingly angry with the nations that are at ease, for while I was angry but a little, they furthered the disaster. The good news for Jerusalem, though, is in verse 16, he's going to say, I have returned to Jerusalem with mercy, going back to the first half of verse 15, where in comparison to his exceedingly great anger against the nations, he's going to say he is now exceedingly jealous for his people. And therefore, he is coming back to restore not only their portion or their lot in their land, but he's going to restore their prosperity and their esteem in much the same way their shame was great in the days of their deportation. The last section of the chapter giving one more vision, that of 4 horns and 4 craftsmen, going from verses 18 through 20, the end of the chapter. The 4 horns, understanding that horns typically represent power in the Bible. Literally here, it's going to represent the four nations that were used to scatter his people. It's going to say in verse 18, or actually verse 19, but the four craftsmen are those who are going to humble the four horns, because as we saw in the previous section, they went too far in executing judgment on God's people. Verse 21, concluding the chapter, actually it's 21 verses. We'll read like I said, as it concludes, and I said, what are these coming to do? He said, these are the horns that scattered Judah so that no one raised his head. And these, referring back to the craftsmen, have come to terrify them, to cast down the horns of the nations who lifted up their horns against the land of Judah to scatter it. This chapter quite possibly reminding me most of the fact that there are no easy answers with God. Understanding why spiritual discernment or wisdom is so important. Understanding that while the nations who had been empowered to execute a task for God were at rest, they did not realize that God was growing exceedingly angry against them for the way in which, as we've seen before, that they went too far. Reminding me quite possibly of two things. One of the things that made David so successful as a leader in Israel was the way in which he consistently sought God's guidance, no matter how successful he had been in the past. Reminding me of Psalm 19, which I think was written by David. The way it concludes, God, please keep me back from presumptuous sins, assuming that past success guaranteed future success, which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. May God give us a heart to consistently seek to understand his will, to keep us back from presumptuous sins.